Thank you all for being here, and especially I want to thank Uli, Mary Jane, and Joe for all the work they've done to make this series happen. It's, to me, been a remarkable set of lectures, and each one seems to have raised the bar higher in ways that this became increasingly intimidating to contemplate. At first I was like, yeah, Marx, I got it, no problem. I was like, oh, I saw things that shook me deeply. Like, for example, I've never done a PowerPoint anything in my life. But I wanted to have something for you to see, and so this is Karl Marx. And if you want to know, like biographical things that about him when he was born, let me Google that for you. There it is. That's him. I can't. He seems to have been born in 1818 and died in 1883. That sounds plausible to me. And it is tricky, it seems to me, to speak about Marx. Because there's baggage with Marx. Part of me thought, why am I not speaking about somebody incredibly obscure from, like, was Karl Barth even count? I should go back to neo-Orthodox German Christian theology from my master's degree. Why deal with Marx? Stay clear. Because, some of the baggage would include that if we say, like Heidegger, there's this question of his relationship to Nazism, we're only asking if he was, like, into it. Not whether he was, like, responsible for the whole thing, right? But with Marx, it's sort of like, oh yeah, Marx, communism? So much of the 20th century on his shoulders, like, for good, but probably at this point not really for good. Stalin and 20 million killed, and oh, God, the Gulag. It's messy business with this guy. And he was, in fact, an organizer who really, International Working Men's Association kind of stuff. In addition to dying of dust inhalation from the British Museum, he also, was out there for communism. I don't know that I want to bear that burden by associating myself with him. I don't know why I would want to associate myself with him. There are other things that make me not want to really talk about Marx. For example, I wanted to study labor, and as soon as you say labor, people do feminism is to gender what socialism is to labor. That is, if you're interested in gender, obviously feminism is the politics. If you're interested in labor, then socialism is the politics. And I thought that was a little fast, isn't there a way we could talk about labor without it always already going back to a presumption of socialism? And in a certain way, I want to do that with Marx. Can't we talk about Marx and his relevance without presuming automatically that its value, even though the book's called Capital, none of us believe it. And it could have been called Labor, but even there, that wouldn't matter. It really is about communism or socialism or something like that. It's always the politics of socialism and communism. And, the Communist Party and socialist parties always thought of labor unions as the transmission belt of revolution. That's why labor was interesting, because it was going to deliver up the revolution. So you can't talk about labor at all without part of the socialist project. I want to see what he thinks about capital and labor without talking necessarily so fast about capitalism and socialism. In fact, I would think that in some respects, part of the reason that we know we could say capitalism as an ism was because we knew something followed it, called socialism. If you don't, or communism. And if you don't have that ism, I don't even know how you know that you're here. In capitalism, I know that there's capital. You can see it traded in the capital markets every day. Read the Financial Times, and they'll tell you what happened in the capital markets yesterday. Capitalism, I'm not so sure how we know. I guess feudalism was one of the ways we knew. I have questions about the quick move to ism when the book is capital and we could think capital for a minute without system transformation, maybe. Not sure. A couple of more quick things about why I really don't want to talk about Marx. Sometimes in contemporary politics, Marx is a weapon you use to beat up deconstruction, feminism, black liberation politics, queer theory, all the identity politics, all of it. That's that fancy English department stuff. We've wasted all that time in cultural battles trying to take over the history department and the English department when there's class. That's the real. And when you're going to start talking about Marx, see the masculinism coming in right here? Let's get down to it. Get our feet in. Remember the Van Gogh? This is a guy named Fred Jameson, a contemporary Marxist, in his book on postmodernism. Talks about the Van Gogh painting of the muddy work boot and compares it to Warhol's diamond dust shoes, yeah? And that obviously the postmodern is this, see it, airy-fairy? Catch that? Whereas the working boots, real politics. So like a guy named Alan Sokol in the middle of the 90s just goes after science studies and culture wars, saying we need to get back to the real politics of economic revolution, I think. So I don't really want to be part of that little white guy thing at all, and the masculinism of it doesn't seem actually even necessary for the reading of Marx at all. Maybe it's in Marx, but there's maybe other things too. There might be other reasons, but those were the big ones. Oh, I know. This is why I think it's complicated to talk about Marx, not why I don't want to. Because I think people think like factories, blue-collar workers. That's, like when you're talking about Marx, really he's about 19th century, workhouses that you can picture. It's like Dickens, that's Marx and Dickens. And what has that to do with now? It's not really about contemporary stuff. Or if it is, you have to go find the factories. So, revolutionary Maoists go to colonize the plant, and you got to go and find a factory in out there in America. You go from your college campus Maoist group out into America to find working class people whose hands have grease on them. And that's who you work with to be relevant to capitalism and Marxism. I'm thinking, I want to find something in here that doesn't conjure that either. Doesn't necessarily. I was stunned when my own mentor, a guy named Stanley Aronowitz, started talking about a factory in Linden, New Jersey, a GM factory, which we went to go see. It was the only time in my life I've seen an auto plant. And it was cool. It's not there anymore because there's nothing really left of auto production in New England. I think that's totally true. Tarrytown, New Jersey's gone. Tarrytown, New York, and Linden, New Jersey. But, I think we could just as well be here and talk about labor and capitalism, in our own shoes. You don't have to go find someone else, save someone else. I want to talk about if Marx is relevant, he should be relevant right here, right now, without any out-of-body experiences required. I don't know if you know what I mean. Sort of stand in the place where you live. That this doesn't imply paternalistic helping of some desperate other. There may be something else at work. So one of the things is that the Marx you read gives you the politics you need. And so people go to Marx for very different reasons and, find what they're looking for. It's so much that's going on in his work that you can get just a ton of different politics out of Marx. And so I'm thinking like there's something, the Occupy Wall Street moment right now, and I'm thinking of course we should be talking about Marx right now, because Occupy Wall Street, they're talking about capitalism. It has to be that connection. It's like live, But I'm trying to think like there's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. You know what I'm saying? Like they're about something, but they're not. They may be knowing, they're not saying. What are you? I mean, come on, there's a freaking busload every week going down to Occupy Wall Street with like a big Wesleyan chartered bus thing, isn't there? Is there a bus? Somebody told me there was a bus. What do we want? I don't know. When do we want it? Probably sooner rather than later, but whatever. We'll first do a lot of talking. What kind of politics could one find in Marx that would be appropriate to the moment? I think the place to begin for that Occupy Wall Street mode, if I can imagine it, is what we should think of as the young Marx. I want to talk first about what later scholars would differentiate between the work of the young Marx and the older Marx. Figures especially like Louis Althusser, French social theorist, writing, let's say, in the 60s and 70s, killing his wife really at the end of the 70s, so that's probably why we don't read him that much anymore. Never know really what to do about that one, but late Marx, I think we can still say that even though Althusser's name is no good anymore. The early Marx would include chiefly a wonderful opening that happened in the intelligentsia when the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 became sort of available and emerged as an alternative to what I'll talk about later, which is a kind of economistic Marxism that was from his later period, and therefore what people were inheriting on the ground. And so then the economic and philosophical manuscripts show up, and it's like, oh wait, he's not an economist, he's a philosopher. We're talking Hegel all over again. This is not out of place in our series, right? This is totally about Hegel, and Marx's relationship to Hegel is that he's part of a group of young Hegelians. Top of the heap, Ludwig Feuerbach. Is that close? Who, as a case study for his mentor Hegel, said, I know what you're talking about with this alienation, because if you look at Christianity and the essence of Christianity and religion, actually more generally, what you get is a situation where people who are in fact the power of the world, the locus of agency, who are subjects, lose sight of that. They forget, and the world's turned on its head, topsy-turvy, and they talk about God as this other that is actually the locus of power. Totalitaire, alitaire, and the grace of God is what you wait for, because there is the power, and we merely await a power that is no longer ours and worship idols of our own making that we fetishize but no longer recognize as our own. We take the object that we made and make it a subject, and thereby forfeit our own subject position, our subjectivity, our positions as self-managing, self-conscious humans in the fullest sense. Now, Marx, it's like, I get Feuerbach, nice move, I get it, great case study, Christianity, I tip my hat. I thought maybe I'd write about religion, but I see that you did that. All right, I need another case study. The labor market's tight in academia. Let me see. Capitalism works too, just like religion. Look at it. Look at it out there, people. There's workers working, making alien objects that they no longer take to be their own self, but is a world that is full of things that are overcoming us, that we are not now the makers of our world. We have created an alien world called capitalism that becomes a power. Like, oh my God, capitalists and capitalism, they are the power. That's where the power is. We have nothing. And we are alienated from this world. We have no ability to live out the fullness of ourselves because we are dominated by things. I think I have a slide. This is Marx. Just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, the human brain, and the human heart detaches itself from the individual and reappears as the alien activity of a god or a devil. So the activity of the worker in his own is not his own. I changed a lot of the gender, I missed that one. So the activity of the worker is not his own spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is a loss of his self. There is a notion here, of course, that when we are right, when we are on our feet and not in a topsy-turvy world, we are what we make, and the world is ours through our metabolizing of it. But in this, our own activity becomes alien to us. And I wanted to show that he's riffing on Feuerbach because he's talking about religion. One more? This is the part I don't usually do. Like, I like the picture, but I'm not sure about reading a lot of text. I thought, I don't know, you can read along. The devaluation of the human world grows in direct proportion to the increase in value of the world of things. It is the same in religion. The more a worker puts into God, the less she retains within herself. The externalization of the worker in her product means not only that her labor becomes an object in external existence, but that it exists outside her, independent of her, and alien to her, and begins to confront her as an autonomous power. It's a question of power. Where is the locus of power? And for the young Hegelians, they were saying, like, we could have it all. The power is here. You think it's there, come on back home to the essence of humanity in its fullness and its righteous metabolization of the world. There should be no other anymore because the subject comes to subsume the object. That's the vision. And so, like you would come down to humanism instead of religion, so too you would go from capitalism to some kind of appropriate humanism where the world was back in touch with itself instead of in an alien capitalist world. Before I go on to that, actually I want to see his picture while we talk. When we talk about the politics that this Marx unleashes, talk about what is the significance of that moment of the young Marx. I actually think it's probably the one at this point most pervasive, and most pervasive among the kind of moment politically, among those involved in a moment very much like Occupy Wall Street, I think, which is that the language becomes we need to take back our world. There is a power. And they tried to actually go find it, like in New York. They were like, we're going to find the power. I think it lives on East 63rd street, like they were going to the mansions to be like, that's where the power is. We're taking it back to the park, I think, and then we're gonna what is it? There's a new clapping when you like something, when you don't like something, or something like that. Yeah. But it's very democratic from here out. This is the main point. It's like what the despotism of an alienated world becomes the self-sovereign self-management at last of a world where full democratic participation is our great accomplishment. It is our revolution. It also means, though, that you have a Marx here where the fundamental issue is oppression. The fundamental issue is alienation, and that capitalism is a soul-sucking system, not so much about exploitation per se. It's a system of alienation that affects all of society. Everyone's infected with the infestation of these alien forces. And in fact, Lukács in History Class Consciousness will later go on to argue that in this reified world, thingified, the things come to dominate, the intelligentsia actually has it worst off. Worst? That's a worse off? Worst off. They have it really bad because for professionals, they want not just your labor. We could labor, but think about other things, including revolution or whatever, but all they want is your arms or your legs or whatever. Among professionals, what they want is, in fact, your soul. They want full-on engagement. You are what you do. You identify with the work. Now, that means that when you get a movement of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society in the United States in the early 60s, you've got a generation of college kids whose elders were saying, go to the factories, you got to go align yourself with the labor unions, I don't know, maybe become a machinist, something. And they're like, really? I mean, I don't know that I want to do that, but on the other hand, I am pretty middle class at this point, And, much to his dismay, Todd Gitlin also turned out to be white and a man, and so he was like, oh my God, I have nothing. What would be my politics except resentment? I think resentment turned out to be the answer there, but the other scenario was to say, even on, and maybe especially on college campuses, what we're talking about is an alienated world where we're being put through a machine, many machines really. In our education system, it has nothing to do with education and learning and the expansive opportunities to pursue thought. It's about machining for degrees and credentials and maps onto 1,000 professions, and we have a turf management program, but not just turf management in terms of class. You also have if this seems liberal artsy, because you're supposed to be able to learn how to read and write and think critically. Later, you'll call back and we'll need your law school applications or your Masters of Public Health things. You're not done being put through the machine. But even here, grading, you get it? They're like, this is man in the gray flannel suit territory here. This is the 8:17 train to New York. And it's not that we're poor or exploited. It's that capitalism is killing us slowly inside through the instrumentalization of our world. A machining on a grid where time is spatialized. Instead of the flux of time, internal time consciousness, sometimes an hour and a half can feel, depending on the lecture, like 4 hours. Sometimes, what is the other one? Sorry, I got nervous about that. How time flies when you're having fun. But the watch is a machining and a spatialization of time. And everything gets put on a grid. You have an ID number. Are you your ID number? No, I am not my ID number. This is the politics of it. And so it became available for anyone. And it becomes, if we can continue on this track for a minute, focused on a kind of cultural politics ultimately, right? You're not going to spend a lot of time once we're here necessarily looking at production. You're going to look at culture. And even when you look at culture, you're not moving from the factory to the studio where TV's being produced in a sort of cookie cutter, banal, flat, dead way. You're actually going to the living room. It's not about the workers who put on who do the sitcoms. It's not about the production even. It's about consumption, and Marxism becomes a politics of consumption around a critique of the culture industry. So this line leads in terms of a genealogy. If you're talking about the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno. No, I learned about him recently, actually. I had a break and I lost a fair amount in the drinking, but I think I was remembering Adorno, Horkheimer, Lukács, Marcuse. These are the figures who have us turn to the banality of our culture. And of course, this is wonderful for middle class folks who Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist, would say, who need some cultural capital. So one of the things conveniently that you could do is be like, oh, God, I'm so opposed to the trashy mass culture of the culture industry. Like, God, I mean, those bands, like, I'm so sick of pop, and I'm so sick of, like, the big sitcoms. I watch not movies, but film, and not just any film, but French film. And a friend of mine said, and I listen to bands that haven't even been created yet. It's not the only place things can go, but there's a fair amount of a line here where you get, for example, Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord, Society of the Spectacle, which is a sort of manifesto in a way of 1968 and the movement of the New Left. There's all the quotes are Feuerbach. All the quotes are, we're in this alienated world of TV crap, and we're going to make it all new. Relationships will find intersubjectivity and mutuality instead of thingification. And of course, it's also just anti-consumerist, punto, period. This politics is like, we can't be into the stuff because the capitalist world of alienation has all these elements of like superficial theatricality, fashion. No fashion. No theater, no accessorizing, no pleasure in commodities. If we have to, we buy things, but we try to make our own hummus. You know what I mean? DIY, we're going to do it yourself everything. And we're going to live simply, probably, at least for a little while, so that so that others can simply live. And maybe we do. I did try, I confess. The young Cutler, I don't know what you want to call it. I had a bowl that I carried around with me in my backpack that would be what I would always eat on. And I stopped having a bed because I thought I need to live lightly on the world and learn to do that. So if I'm going to be like light, I'm going to have to get rid of my bed. Beds are bad. And the worst thing that happened was you'd find out you'd like have a Marxist come over and see your brass bed. You'd be like, oh my God, I'm such a hypocrite. Because I thought I was a kind of Marxist, and turns out, look, this is my bed. Look at that duvet. Fantastic. And so in the culture critique, this anti-theatricality also winds up, it seems to me, implying a productivism, that when you get real and you go backstage behind the theater, there's not the pretensions of the theater, but the reality behind stage where everything is what it is, finally. And this is what Derrida goes after in The Spectres of Marx, where he says, look, Marx and Feuerbach were trying to kill ghosts. They were ghost slayers. The ghost of religion that haunts us. And we must slay that ghost to be able to come back to ourselves. And capitalism has all these ghosts. And we must slay the ghosts until everything is what it is. And of course, for Derrida, he's very concerned that identity that ultimately triumphs over difference generates a very problematic politics, a very violent politics, where what we're talking about is, on the best sense, the democratic absorption and metabolization of the whole world so that nothing is other to you anymore, which could also sound an awful lot like the colonization of everything. That was maybe a little fast, but, you know. There is also in that productivism that says we do real things, we do real work. We're not about leisure. We're not about flim-flam of fashion. We're about the real stuff, and the real stuff is always reproductive. This is kind of, the work of reproduction. Like sex is for, of course, Marxists don't like to sound like this exactly, but Marx sounds like this exactly, that sex is not really for fun, people. It's part of the reproductive world, and only when it becomes like eating, an end unto itself, have we lost its integration with a larger project of our species. Productivism that winds up being heteronormative, masculinist, there's a lot of things that one could say. But also its aspiration is democratic, and its credo would seem to be that ultimately, instead of being told to work, where labor and leisure in alienated society are separated and we have to be told by somebody else to work, when you unify these things, labor and leisure are no longer separated. Work and play are one. And you whistle while you work. And this is the revolution in a way. Now, I want to say, first of all, before I forget it, I will, I think I already did, that one of the critiques of this that comes is that the logic of participation, everybody in, and I will do it all by myself, is actually and will come to be seen as the cultural logic of capitalism, which makes it pretty insidious that a kind of revolutionary project is actually implicated in a cultural logic of capital. I want to do that in a minute. I also want to say there is this thing, if you can picture it, of coming out of childhood into maturity, into self-sovereignty, of like, have little kids and you're pushing the healthy food at them with the spoon, and they're like, don't want it. These are very much like resisting capital. You're like, I don't want it. I'm on strike. I'm not into it. Right? And then there's that day where the kid's like, I do it all by myself. And they take the same food and in this massively empowering moment, eat the shit that you wanted them to eat all along, but now they own it. And that's the revolutionary move, is in a way to own it. And I'm not sure that that project of self-sovereignty gets you very far from where you always already were going to be. Okay. But there's another Marx. Different. Probably starts after chapter 1 of Capital Volume 1, because chapter 1 really sounds like the young Marx. It's like, and then he had some nervous breakdown, and he's like, I don't really want to talk this way anymore. I've learned a lot about capitalism. There are some things I saw there that probably weren't just a case study for my young Hegelian friends. He becomes interested in some things about capitalism, and I'd like to say a few things about what those, a few words about what those might be. Because the question is going to become one of exploitation again. I'm not sure, though. What I'd like to do is say, even though it's exploitation, who's in this story of exploitation? Are we back to finding, like, real workers who wear Levi's, do real work? Oh, Obama did a thing, right, on, like, get back to real work. And who's the Levi's, I think, had a thing about real working people and when they wear real jeans. Marx wants to tell us a little story. First of all, go really fast through, original accumulation. He finds now a historical way of thinking capitalism. That's not just this spatial inversion of a topsy-turvy world turned around, but history, like the accumulation, primitive accumulation, which is to say that the capitalism requires the separation of people from the land, from the means of their own subsistence. You have to capitalize agriculture through the introduction of, for example, capital-intensive agriculture, green revolution, so that at this point, in the United States, the percentage of the population that work in the agricultural sectors, like maybe 4%. I don't have the most recent figures, but it's really small. So the sort of the enclosures movement, as it's called, where the land is capitalized and the people are proletarianized. Proletarian, see, I want to say, like, that doesn't mean black and white with the sepia tones. People, proletarians. What it means here is you have nothing to sell but your labor power because you no longer have a relationship with the means of your own subsistence. And so we could talk about how important this could be in contemporary politics and how expansive it is and how obscure sometimes it feels. Kennedy, we were talking about, in Kenya, we were talking about why the U.S. is so, and the IMF, the World Bank, always already about judicial reform is like their first priority. It's like, really, judicial reform? That seems sort of technocratic. Like, there's a lot of things you could focus on around the world. I think I'll not pay attention to the judicial reform. I'll look for the factories or something like that. But judicial reform could be about the fact that to collateralize land, you have to have clarified title ownership to land. And so the judicial reform that makes title to land not a plaything of politics, but inscribed in an independent judiciary, is the precondition for the enclosures of agriculture in Kenya and the movement of people from the land into the city. This is proletarianization. And it's not over is part of what I think. In other words, your Dickens thing, there's a sort of temporality that's totally non-synchronous about where the enclosures have happened and where they haven't. There have been land revolutions of people reclaiming land or resisting being taken off the land. These are struggles that are part of the formation of capital and capitalism as a mode of production itself. Right? Mugabe in Zimbabwe ran into big trouble because a lot of the land's owned by white, large commercial landowners, and they started doing land invasions. It was a movement of veterans movement, started doing land invasions. Africa, there's huge amounts of, South Africa, everything in a way is like, when the ANC came to power, will they insist on land redistribution? And the answer was no, and that's why they're still the darling of the West. There's a politics there around original accumulation. You get proletarianization, you got a lot of people in the city whose labor power is what they sell. I just want to say, I don't know that many people who don't sell their labor power. There are, and there's a personification of capital that you could do. That is those who are what we're going to call Mr. Moneybags, who come to the market with money fundamentally and leave with more money, and that's their whole thing. They don't sell their labor for a wage. But every time you find what you think is a capitalist, and you think they're a capitalist because they're living high on the hog, it's actually precisely that moment when they're not a capitalist, because in capital you constantly have to reinvest the surplus value in production. When you take it out of production for a Ferrari, technically that's out of the realm of capitalization. So hard to find the capitalist, but it's a relation. I have a 401k. That's capital invested in the markets. Some people live entirely off the interest on a principal that's huge. Well, like, you see what I'm saying? That really wealthy people who are CEOs with a lot of money, if they're selling their labor in a market for CEOs, in some sense, they are proletarianized. They're selling their labor for a wage, a good wage, a very good wage. And you have presidents of universities or highly paid tenured professors, I hope. I'm hoping that happens. Who, are not really looking so proly. They're not that proletarianized. But in this sense, they are, because they're selling their labor power for a wage. And if the issue is exploitation, we have to figure out, what would it mean to exploit a white-collar worker? Let's take it there instead of blue-collar. Marx is looking for the key to surplus value. He says, look, got to go quickly through this. What is the value of any commodity? He didn't make this up. This is from Ricardo and the Political Economist. The labor theory of value says the value of any commodity is the labor time necessary to produce that commodity. Labor time. What is the value of labor power? When you sell your labor power, you don't sell yourself. You sell the commodity that is your labor power for a discrete amount of time. What is the value of it? The labor necessary to produce and reproduce the worker. Keep you going. That has a value. Mr. Moneybags, Marx does a tour. It's a really fun tour. You should read it in Capital. Where it's like, okay, we start in the market. Again, it's somewhere in here, but it's not pictures. I don't have pictures of the market. But I always picture the market as, I always have pictures, like, I don't know, some little market that's closed except on certain days, and people come together, and it's probably in, like, Yentl. There's a movie, and there's people selling things. This is the marketplace. And then there's going to be this abode of production. And he says, look, we come to the marketplace, and everything's clean, clear, transparent. He does not think capitalism is about theft or fraud. Is there theft or fraud? Sure. Does he think that that's the basis of capitalist production of surplus value? No. So he wants to take us out of the marketplace to say, we're not talking about cheating. We're not talking about liars. There are liars. You can put them in jail. It's not the point of what capitalism turns on. All this, the money bags goes in. He buys, she buys, she buys everything she'd need to produce, including the means of production, the instruments of production, and labor power. Goes now to, this is where it's, you go from the noisy sphere where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of all men, follow them into the hidden abode of production. Oh my goodness. This is all this stuff about how, like, look, labor goes in, selfishness. There's selfishness on both sides. You don't have to picture labor as automatically a victim. They're there. Everyone's looking out for themselves. There's an exchange. Copy? Yes? Then you go to the abode of production, and here the capitalist all of a sudden strides forth, money owner strides forth as a capitalist, possessor of labor power follows as his laborer, the one with an air of importance, smirking intent on business, the other timid and holding back like one who is bringing his own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a tanning. And so then, do I have the picture? Yeah. There's text and there's a picture. I thought I'm not going to be able to do it fast without the picture. Let's do this first. This is time. A day, let's say. Could be a year. Doesn't really matter. The unit doesn't matter. A, B, and C. A to B is the amount of time that a worker, anywhere, be here, don't go someplace else, that a worker does to produce value. That when you work, you produce value. When you produce the same amount of value as it takes to keep you alive. That's the equal exchange, right? You pay enough so that the commodity that I sell, I can reproduce. Come back to work the next day. So at this point in the day, I've done all this work, produced value, and we could call it a day, just produce that. The capitalist goes back to the market with the stuff, sells the stuff, but Marx says just gets nothing more than they started with, because all the instruments and their value didn't change, and all you got was the value produced by the worker, but you paid them in wages the value of the necessary labor to produce and reproduce them, so you got nothing. But because labor is, Marx says, the creation of value, you could extend, or if you could extend, the amount of work done. Now, you've produced enough value to produce and reproduce your worker that you hired, but also now they're going to keep working and keep producing value, and when you go to the market, you'll have more value than you came with, only because you bought that commodity labor power, they say, Marx is saying. And so you have surplus value. And the whole thing turns on like, you could extend C pretty far, and B doesn't move. B is your wages. C is the amount of work you do. For Marx, all of a sudden, labor is not that from which we are alienated. It's that which we have too much of. Work hours. The lengthening of the workday. Now, I got to say, this is where I want to take it professional for 2 seconds, like white-collar stuff. The labor movement in the United States, Fair Labor Standards Act, only applies to various definitions around blue-collar workers, not white-collar workers. And it says 40-hour work week is the basic work week. You want to work somebody more than 40 hours a week, you got to pay them overtime. It's in some ways like a response to saying, yeah, this is the battle line. The work day. How much work for the money? Professionals, like blue-collar workers are hourly. It's all delineated how much work. Blue-collar work, white-collar work, excuse me. You go for salaried people, like Marx has nothing to do with salaried people. Bullshit. Marx has more to do at this point with salaried people than anybody else. Why? Because they set in a salary the value, the money they'll pay to reproduce you for a year. And that's your salary, and it is what it is, right? And we don't even talk about how much work in that year. And we're not even involved politically at all in trying to manage as a struggle how much work for the year. But they care a lot. Right? Because if they can hold a flat fee to reproduce you, but make you work more every hour that you work long days. Know any professionals who work long hours per day? I do. Know any professionals who then work many days per week? So like the whole weekend idea, kind of out the window. No professionals who are like, yeah, I mean, I'm in it all the time. Jeez. And then like, oh my God, your paid vacation? I think that would be better if at least you brought like your BlackBerry or something, because we're reproducing you that whole time, and it would be great if you could be producing some value, please, at all times. You see what I'm saying? And we don't really struggle about any of it. And part of why is because we identify with it. We're like, oh, this is me, this is my work, I'm a professional, I bleed red cardinal blood. You know what I mean? There's a struggle around time that Marx says is at the heart of capitalism, where work, not me, right? I was so scared. I was so scared that I was going to forget. that if the central axis in capitalism is the struggle around work, then we're not paying very much attention to it. And if the cultural logic of capital is to extend the amount of work and, let's say, diminish the amount of pay, however possible, to its bare minimum, then it would follow that to be anti-capital, I don't know anti-capitalist, but to be anti-capital would be to fight for its inverse. That is, the battle would be for less work and more pay. Marx says, yeah, I see that. That would be cool. He knows. Got a whole chapter on the working day, struggles for shorter hours. He's like, yeah, and I don't even know why we'd go back the second day once we were like, you played a trick on me yesterday, you worked me that long and got all that extra work, exploitation, I'm so not coming back tomorrow. That sucked for me. That tanning. And then the employer says to you, but look out the window at the reserve army of labor. The desperately unemployed who flood the labor market and make it impossible. Marx says, they curb the pretensions of labor. Love that phrase. Curbs the pretensions of labor is what the reserve army does. We're talking supply and demand here, and I want to either pause or wrap it up, not sure, to say, at this point, he's probably right. He says les pipes sont, I don't know, the dice are loaded in French. I don't know how you say that. Thank you. Maybe it's not that great, but maybe it's not the dice are loaded. But dice are loaded, it works totally fine here. Because he's saying, look, capital always can manage in the labor market. Back to the market, if all that abode of production was the place of exploitation, it's back in the market with flooded labor markets that capital's going to get you. And I just think, look, I don't know, maybe that's true, that it's always going to be that way. Marx says, and as soon as people fight for shorter hours and higher pay, the political economists, the econ department people, start crying about free trade and freedom of contract, and they get all upset. This is his words, not mine. But he doesn't really say why a struggle of workers for shorter hours and higher pay wouldn't, A, through shorter hours, they know that the supply of labor is variable based on, for example, the workday, and they know they can get more labor, and it's different than the number of workers. The amount of work and the number of workers, different things. That was a quote I was going to show you. Totally different things. If labor learned the same thing, that the number of people and the supply of labor power are not the same thing. You could have lots of people, but if you have reduced supply of labor, you soak up supply. They panic about it. I got into this because I was reading the Financial Times, and they were worried about supply, labor supply, running out of labor supply, 3.9%, end of the 90s. It's like, oh, fuck, not revolution. We could have fun with leverage. And what I want to say is market leverage. If this is the project, right now we're down on our luck. We don't have any market leverage, flooded labor market relative to supply of labor relative to demand. Market leverage as the turning point, historically, is so different than humanity coming back to itself. Do you see what I'm saying? How do we get market leverage? So different than Feuerbach. There's more we could say about how relative surplus value works, where the line B moves through the revolutionization of all means of production and the real subsumption of society where everything is commodified and transformed, so that labor-saving technologies displace traditional forms of labor and lead to a situation where capitalism is a historically dynamic and revolutionary transformational moment where if absolute value is blocked, when workers are able to say, no more here, I'm not moving, capital winds up revolutionizing every agriculture, domestic everything, everything. Everywhere there are workers who say no. The postal workers, radical union. Postal workers, guess what? Email. You know, like, gotcha. You see what I'm saying? And also they move it from a state thing to the capitalization of transports. You got FedEx and what, which aren't like public. You capitalize it. We're almost there. It's so slow. The capitalization and real subsumption of academia. What is it, Phoenix University is what it's called? Oh my God. If you're thinking that capitalism is revolutionary and some interesting things happen through capitalization and the antagonisms of labor in the marketplace, workers, capital, buyers, sellers, permanent antagonism, we're like nowhere here. Like Linden's transformed in part because the auto industry automated against UAW workers who resisted. And academia is really pretty much untouched so far in terms of real subsumption. We're like the home, the haven in a heartless world or something. Anyway, I'm going to stop by saying alienation from labor, in which case we own it, or really the vision here is higher wages, shorter hours, all the way down, meaning essentially socialism is not a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, or the opposite or whatever. It's the liberation from labor itself. Anyway, those are two Marxes, and I'd be interested to know, how that plays out, but I thank you for your attention.